This is the second part of a two-part story. The scratching in his head didn't harmonize, it settled. It became a low, internal churning, the wet, rhythmic click of something moving just beneath the bone. He rose, and the grinding in his joints wasn't gone, just muted, replaced by a deep, greasy ache as his ligaments stretched and settled into their new positions. He was no longer a ghost. He was a thing with a pulse, a walking repository of borrowed life. He moved back to his apartment, his gait no longer his own. Each step was a controlled fall, his body moving with a disjointed, marionette-like smoothness. The city didn't shrink, it flattened, losing its depth, becoming a backdrop painted in shades of gray and flickering neon. The sounds of the night weren't a menu. They were a dull, constant pressure against his eardrums, like being underwater. When he reached his room, he didn't check the mirrors or the walls. He didn't look for the messed-up book. He peeled away the clothes, now stiff and cold with dried blood, the fabric catching on the unfamiliar contours of his body, and climbed into bed. The sheets were a suffocating weight, the darkness a thick, clinging shroud. For the first time in a week, Silas closed his eyes, but there was no letting go. He simply waited, suspended in the quiet. The drum of his heart was there, a steady, heavy beat, but beneath it, another rhythm pulsed, a soft, wet shifting, the sound of something rearranging itself in the dark. The morning light sliced through the window, a sterile blade of white that offered no comfort, only illumination. Silas's eyes fluttered open not to warmth, but to a profound, draining cold, as if his very marrow were being siphoned through 1,000 invisible needles. The miracle of the night before was a rotting promise, its sweetness already curdling into decay. He pushed himself upright, and his shoulder emitted a sound like grinding bone and gristle, a wet, tearing crunch that sent a jolt of pure agony through him. He stared at his hands. The vibrant, living flesh was already sloughing away, revealing a mottled, grayish-green undertone that pulsed with a sickly, fungal light. The new nails, once pristine and strong, were now brittle and discolored, the quicks swollen with a purple-black corruption that seeped towards the tips like spilled ink. This wasn't just decay. It was a frantic, desperate consumption of his own body. He instinctively brought a hand to his head, and as his fingers brushed against his scalp, a thick, wet sheaf of hair peeled away from his skull, leaving behind a patch of raw, weeping flesh. The clump landed on the pristine sheets with a soft, wet slap, a dead thing staining the white with its own putrescence. The exposed skin of his scalp was a cold, numb landscape, a prelude to the ruin that was claiming him piece by agonizing piece. The embryonic parasites nested in his viscera were stirring, their hunger a gnawing void that echoed through his hollowing frame. The last meal, the thing that had once been a man, was already dissolving into nutrient slurry, a fleeting balm against the relentless consumption of his own tissue. He fumbled for the amber bottle of cologne on the nightstand, the stench of his own decay already leaching through his pores. It was the perfume of a charnel house, iron-rich blood, the sour tang of bile, and the cloying sweetness of putrefaction. As he splashed the liquid over his neck and chest, a wet, tearing sound ripped through the silence from the kitchen. Rayup, day and night bled into an indistinguishable twilight of agony and mounting dread. Silas lay curled in the bathtub, the cold porcelain slick with the filth of his own undoing. His home had become a tomb, his body a living sepulchre. The decay was not a gentle fading, but a brutal vivisection from within. The trauma of the morgue had left him emotionally cauterized. A man who had survived the unthinkable only to find the unthinkable was now his permanent state. He was a prisoner of a reality where the boundary between the living and the harvested had been permanently erased. Each passing hour brought fresh horrors. His skin, once taut, now hung in loose, gray folds, the connective tissue liquefying like overboiled gristle. The cologne had curdled on his flesh, mingling with the thick, black ichor that oozed from his tear ducts and the ruptured capillaries of his ears. He smelled like the lie he was trying to tell, a rotting thing pretending to be a man, he sent a nauseating collision of artificial flowers and the iron tang of the grave. The skittering inside him had escalated into a constant, churning turmoil. He could feel the calcified forms of the bone centipedes scraping against his ribcage, their sharpened legs hooking into the spongy meat of his lungs with every desperate breath. Every breath was a reminder that he was no longer the inhabitant of his body, but a larder for a swarm that was already celebrating his disappearance. By the third day, the air in the bathroom was a palpable miasma of rot, so thick he gagged with each shallow gasp. His jaw, unmoored from its hinges, lolled at a grotesque angle, the ligaments having melted into stringy, gray pulp. When he attempted to drink, the water simply cascaded through a yawning, black-rimmed hole in his cheek, splattering onto his chest with a wet, hollow patter. The memory of the office, the looks of disgust, the way his boss had backed away from the smell, burned in his mind as a final rejection. He was a freak to the world, a ghost to his girlfriend, and a meal to the things in the walls. The afternoon arrived with a silence that was absolute, a void in which only the frantic, fluttering drumming of his own blood against his eardrums existed. It was the sound of a trapped bird beating itself to death against the bars of its cage. The psychological weight of Alara's betrayal sat on his chest heavier than the rot. She had replaced him before he was even cold, her love as fragile as the skin currently sliding off his fingers. Silas's left hand, a foreign thing attached to his wrist, lurched towards the tub's edge. Through the cracked lenses of his sunglasses, the world dissolved into a jaundiced smear. His fingers, swollen and discolored, found purchase on the cold porcelain, but the expected pressure was absent. Instead, a greasy, visceral slithering met his touch, a sensation of something wet and profoundly wrong. The realization hit him with a cold, jagged clarity. The mortician hadn't just violated his body. He had unraveled the very nature of Silas's existence. He wasn't a man recovering from a coma. He was a rewoven portion that had somehow learned to remember its name. A choked gasp, dry and sharp as shattered glass, escaped his lips. He could only watch, a detached observer to his own disintegration, as the flesh of his ring finger abandoned its post. It was not a violent rending, but a slow, obscene uncoupling. The gray, mottled sheath of skin and muscle, its surface a roadmap of necrotic veins and capped with a blackened, crumbling nail, slithered down the skeletal scaffold. It peeled away like a sodden glove, a wet, heavy flop echoing in the tiled room as it struck the porcelain. What remained was not a finger, but a spike, a gleaming, nacreous white length of bone, scrubbed clean and polished by the passage of the flesh that had abandoned it. The sight of the bone offered a terrifying epiphany. The Silas that had been loved and touched was just a costume, and the monster in the morgue had simply begun the process of unzipping it. But the bone's nakedness was fleeting. From the raw, pulpy crater at his knuckle, a chittering tide erupted. A dozen bone centipedes, their bodies constructed from interlocking plates of bleached cartilage and sharpened rib fragments, poured forth. They swarmed the ivory spike, their multitude of needle-like legs scrabbling for purchase. A high-frequency drone, like 1,000 microscopic saws, filled the air as they began their work, their legs vibrating into a blur, grinding and flaking the exposed bone, burrowing into the porous marrow to feast. He felt their vibrations not as pain, but as an intimate, internal violation, a rhythmic scraping that suggested his own skeleton was being hollowed out to make room for something else's architecture. Silas's gaze locked on the white javelin of bone protruding from his hand, the final, obscene monument to his ruin. His sanity, already cracked, finally shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. He was no longer a person, a being of thought and will. He was a thing, a still-living pantry, a conscious slab of meat, its flesh now merely a rental property for the horrors within. The violation of the morgue was now complete. The mortician had stolen his dignity, and now his own biology was stealing his form, leaving him a passenger in a vessel that had declared him an unwanted guest. His eyes drifted back to the tub. The discarded sheath of his finger lay there, a limp, gray tube of necrotized tissue. It looked less like a part of a man and more like the discarded casing of some grotesque, parasitic grub, its purpose served and its host hollowed out. He felt a strange, detached envy for that scrap of meat. It was finally free of the burden of being Silas, while he remained trapped in the wreckage, forced to witness every wet, sliding inch of his own erasure. He lay frozen, a prisoner in his own collapsing flesh. His form was no longer his own, but a grotesque architecture of decay, each chamber a festering wound, each wall weeping foulness. The gray, membranous skin of his fingers blistered and puckered, the sinew and muscle beneath dissolving into a rancid, black soup that pulsed with a sickening life of its own. Through the translucent veil of his flesh, a writhing network of dark veins throbbed, a nest of engorged, black leeches feasting on the last vestiges of his life. His psychological state had flattened into a dull, thrumming acceptance. He was the soil, he was the grave, and the friends were merely the gardeners of his inevitable bloom. The air itself had become a physical assault, a suffocating miasma of coppery blood, sour stomach acid, and the cloying, sickly sweet stench of his own organs fermenting in the stagnant heat of the room. Silas inhaled, and the rot felt like an old friend, a heavy, suffocating blanket that confirmed his suspicion. He was no longer a person, but a chemical reaction in the shape of a man. Each ragged gasp was a battle against the wet, heavy weight of his own disintegrating lungs, which felt as if they were filled with clotted, blood-soaked cotton. His consciousness flickered like a failing bulb, retreating from the pain into a cold, clinical detachment, observing his own expiration as if reading the fine print of a contract he'd never signed. A thick, dark ichor, viscous and foul, began to ooze from his pores, tracing long, greasy rivers down the porcelain tub, staining it with the evidence of his liquefying form. He watched the rivers flow, feeling a strange, hollow sense of relief. As the fluid left him, so did the last of his petty, human worries. His hair, once a dark crown, now abandoned him in massive, clotted wads, each one a grotesque tribute to his decay, clogging the drain in a thick, slimy mat. His scalp was a nightmarish landscape of weeping pustules and waxy, gray necrotic patches. One of his ears had become a flaccid, useless flap, the delicate cartilage having melted away into a quivering, gelatinous mass. To Silas, these were no longer his features, but discarded packaging for a version of himself he didn't yet understand, a shedding of the Silas that the mortician had so casually broken. He stared, his mind a blank canvas of horror, as his middle finger began to droop. The skin at the knuckle tore open with a wet, ripping sound, a gaping, bloodless maw revealing the yellow, glistening fat beneath. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the slightest tremor, the smallest involuntary twitch, would send the rest of the flesh slithering down, leaving behind a skeletal hand of clicking, yellowed bone. He found himself rooting for the bone, a desperate psychological pivot that embraced the ivory over the rot, craving the cleanliness of the skeleton over the filth of the flesh. The scratching in his ribs had escalated into a frantic, high-pitched chittering, the manic scrabbling of countless tiny limbs, a celebration of the skeleton's impending liberation. The noise was a substitute for his own thoughts, a rhythmic, bone-deep static that drowned out the memory of the hospital, the park, and the woman who had shrieked at his return. He sat in the suffocating silence of his apartment, a living tomb of his own design, his gaze fixed on the exposed bone of his hand, waiting with a detached terror for the next piece of himself to slough away, to fall, to become just another piece of rot in the porcelain coffin. In the quiet, he realized he wasn't waiting for death. He was waiting for the harvest to finally finish its work and turn his trauma into a portion. Silas dragged himself from the tub, a marionette with tangled strings. Each joint screamed in protest, a wet, tearing sound as ligaments shredded and bone scraped against bone. He felt his own flesh sloughing from his skeleton in thick, gelatinous sheets, pooling in the water with a nauseating plop. Fear was a distant memory, a concept for the whole. He was now a fractured consciousness, a shard of singular, ravenous purpose. The violation in the morgue had done more than break his body. It had severed the tether to his own humanity. He moved not as a man, but as a recorded trauma replaying itself in a shell of meat. He lurched into the kitchen, his bare tibia scraping against the linoleum with a sound like chalk on a tombstone. His search was a frantic, twitching patrol of twitching fingers and a thumb that had bent backwards at an impossible angle. He found a long, serrated carving knife, its steel blade marred by dark stains. His blackened, desiccated fingers, more kindling than flesh, closed around the handle, and a tremor ran up his arm, a thrilling echo of the knife's intended purpose. The cold steel felt more like a part of him than his own hand. It was the only thing that felt alive in a world of rot. He avoided the polished steel of the toaster, a warped funhouse mirror he knew would reflect a face he no longer recognized. He didn't need to see the jaundiced, sunken eyes swimming in a skull of papery skin, or the way his jaw hung slack, revealing a blackened tongue coated in a thick, yellow film. His mind refused to project a self-image, recoiling from the sensory evidence of his own expiration. He was a passenger in a corpse, watching through windows of yellowing glass as his own identity dissolved into the smell of formaldehyde. He wrestled a heavy trench coat over his shuddering frame, the fabric catching on protruding bits of his own anatomy. The coat did little to contain the cloying, sweet-sour smell of his own decay, the perfume of a walking tomb. The weight of the coat felt like a burial shroud he had chosen to wear early, a heavy curtain pulled over the mess of what he used to be. The walk to the hospital was an exercise in defiance against his own dissolution. With every step, he felt his skeleton grinding, threatening to collapse into a pile of wet sticks. Chunks of his scalp and hair came away in his hands, fluttering to the pavement like morbid confetti. The scratching in his ribs was no longer a sound but a physical presence, a colony of tiny things burrowing, rearranging him from the inside out, their chittering a chorus of anticipation in his mind. His thoughts were no longer words, but the rhythmic, dry vibrations of the bone legs, a telepathic static that whispered that he was finally perfectly empty. The knife in his pocket was a cold, heavy anchor, the last solid thing in a world of liquefying horror. He slipped through the ambulance bay, a flicker of corrupted data. The security cameras stuttered, their focus unable to resolve his jerky, stuttering form. He was a biological error message in their system. He descended the concrete stairs into the bowels of the building, the air growing thick with the formaldehyde-in flesh cocktail of the morgue, a scent that felt like home. He stood before the heavy lead doors. There was no hesitation. With a strength born of rotting desperation, he threw his shoulder against the metal. The doors screeched open, the pneumatic hiss of the airlock a final, welcoming sigh into the cold, sterile darkness. Inside, under the flickering blue-white glare of the fluorescent lights, he saw the man. Frank sat hunched at a stainless steel desk, his back a rigid line, the clipboard trembling in his grip. The classic rock radio spat a low, distorted tune, the guitar strings like rusty nails scraping through the speaker's cone. A wet, tearing sound echoed softly as Silas's hand, a thing of swollen, purple-gray flesh, emerged from his coat. The knife it held was not metal, but a shard of his own sharpened rib, its serrated edge slick with a black, viscous fluid that pulsed with a faint, sickening light. The bone of his knuckle, pushed through the taut skin, grated against the makeshift blade. Frank froze. The radio continued its tinny wail, but the man's shoulders locked as the scent reached him. Not cologne, but the cloying sweetness of decay, the coppery tang of fresh blood, and the damp, fungal reek of a grave disturbed too soon. Frank, Silas managed to rasp, the word a wet, gurgling expulsion of fluid and air from a throat that was no more than a gaping, weeping wound in the flesh of his neck. Frank turned slowly, his face shifting from irritation to a wide-eyed, paralyzing terror as he beheld the thing standing in the doorway. It was vaguely shaped like Silas, a grotesque parody of a man. The skin was a taut, translucent gray, stretched tight over a skeleton that seemed to shift and rearrange itself with each shallow breath. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow sockets weeping the same black ichor that slicked the floor. The heavy lead doors of the morgue slammed shut, the sound a dull, final thud that vibrated through the floor. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of the thing before him, a pressure that made Frank's ears pop and his lungs burn. He stood paralyzed, the clipboard clattering to the floor, his eyes fixed on the pulsating, cancerous mass of flesh that wore Silas's face like a poorly fitted mask. Then came the wet pops, like a series of knuckles cracking in unison, but deeper, wetter. From the deep, velvet shadows behind the stainless steel lockers, to the 10-legged, eye-covered flesh spiders began to unfold. They did not so much emerge as they did unfurl, their bodies a congealed mass of twitching muscle and glistening black chitin. They hit the tile with the sound of visceral, liquid impact, their 10 spindly, crab-like legs instantly scuttling toward the center of the room. The children's eyes on their pulsating thoraxes rolled frantically, fixating on Frank's throat. They were not human eyes, but perfect blue irises set in sockets of raw, red flesh, a dozen of them embedded in the pulsating sac of each creature's body, blinking in a horrifying, uncoordinated rhythm. But they were not the first to reach him. With a series of jagged, glitchy stutters, nude, broken, glitchy woman materialized from the corners of the room. From a distance, they were a mockery of beauty, their long black hair clinging to the slick, exposed bone of their pale shoulders. As they jerked into the light, the horror was visceral. Their necks were shattered, vertebrae jutting through papery skin, their heads lolling at obscene angles against their collarbones. Cloudy cataracts filmed their eyes, but they saw everything. Two of them reached Frank in a sickening blur of frame rate drops. Their fingernails, sharp and dark as obsidian shards, plunged into his arms, tearing through flesh and sinew with a strength that defied their emaciated forms. Frank tried to scream, but the sound was strangled in his throat as a glitchy, broken-necked woman leaned in close. Her throat was a ruin of torn flesh, gurgling with a thick, black ichor that dribbled down her chest. Then, her torso split open with a wet, tearing sound. A vertical maw, a gaping mouth from her chest to her navel, erupted. A long, serpentine tongue, glistening and dark, lashed out to coil around Frank's neck, pulling his face toward the thousands of needle-like teeth that lined the cavernous opening. They ground together with a mechanical, insatiable hunger. They held him pinned against the cold steel of the autopsy table, his body arching in a silent, screaming spasm of pure, unadulterated terror. The 10-legged, eye-covered flesh spiders swarmed his lower half, their translucent, chitinous legs moving with the speed and precision of industrial machinery. They didn't just bite, they snipped and carved, their sharpened limbs working like surgical shears to peel away long, perfect ribbons of Frank's thigh muscle. Before Silas's horrified eyes, they began to reweave the raw, glistening meat into geometric cubes, the air filling with the coppery tang of fresh blood and the cloying sweetness of the harvester's necrotic secretions. From the suffocating black of the hall, the skeletal man peeled his 6 feet, 9 inches frame into the light, the cartilage in his skeletal knees grinding like a clockwork abomination. He dismissed the writhing Frank as a footnote, his jaundiced, bloodshot eyes locking onto the protagonist with predatory focus. With a wet, tearing sound, he ripped open the flayed skin suit that served as a shirt, exposing the raw, horizontal chasm of his torso. Inside, glistening ropes of intestines and pulsating blue wire veins coiled and slithered. A torrent of black beetles erupted from the cavity, a chittering, living carpet of clicking shells that flowed across the floor towards the gore. The bone centipedes were the final heralds, their arrival marked by a dry, ivory clattering that rose above the static of the radio. They swarmed the table legs, their toothed appendages shredding Frank's trousers like wet paper to reach the soft, fatty treasure of his stomach. Frank remained terrifyingly conscious, his eyes bulging from their sockets as he witnessed his own flesh being meticulously disassembled. The glitchy, broken-necked woman's lashing, barbed tongues gagged him, forcing his shrieks back down his throat in choked gurgles of blood and phlegm. As the vivisection crescendoed, Silas loomed over the wreckage, a serrated knife vibrating in his grip. But the skeletal man extended a cadaverous hand, its bones clicking as it gently, almost reverently, pushed the blade aside. This was not a murder, it was a harvest. When the harvesters had scurried away with the last fleshy cuts, leaving Frank as a quivering, boneless sack of flayed skin and weeping, blackened ooze, the skeletal man advanced to conclude the ritual. He shunned a cloth. Plunging his hand deep into his own chest cavity, he wrenched out a fistful of the blue, wire-like veins. He lashed them across the floor and tables, the vessels acting as high-pressure siphons that greedily drank the spilled blood and viscous ichor. The black beetles swarmed the remaining scraps, their mandibles working like metal files, polishing the stainless steel until it gleamed with a sterile, impossible luster. Within moments, the morgue was immaculate. No trace of Frank remained, no sign of struggle, no droplet of blood. The only testament to the night's carnage was the 6 feet 9 inches skeletal figure standing in the center of the room, his nose slits emitting a thin, mournful whistle as he herded the last of the beetles back into the gaping maw of his chest. The skeletal man pivoted to Silas, his bloodshot eyes fixing on the stark, ivory fingerbone. He reached out with a skeletal claw, proffering a new, gift-wrapped cookie of Frank's compacted meat, neatly bound with a glistening ribbon of blue vein. Silas did not falter. He extended his trembling, gray hand. The one with the ivory finger bone stood exposed against the decay, and accepted the offering from the skeletal man's bony grip. The cookie was searing hot, a dense, pulsating weight of reconstituted Frank that radiated a dark, vital warmth. The skeletal man observed with his unblinking, bloodshot eyes, his head cocked at a sharp, clicking angle as Silas raised the portion to his lips. The slick, semi-transparent membrane peeled away with a wet, sucking slurp, and Silas bit down. The effect was a cataclysmic, biological detonation. A wave of scalding heat razored through Silas's jaw, seared into his skull, and incinerated down his spine like liquid fire. The frantic itching within his ribcage exploded into a high-frequency drone of pure agony and ecstasy. He felt his gums calcify, the loose, gray tissue hardening and flushing with a livid pink as his teeth re-anchored themselves into his jawbone with audible cracks. The sagging, waxy mask of his face stretched taut, the gray necrosis receding before a violent surge of warm, living color. On his hand, the ivory fingerbone was suddenly engulfed in a frantic, bubbling cascade of new flesh. It resembled a grotesque time-lapse of regeneration, the gray meat churning and knitting itself over the white bone in mere seconds until the finger was whole, the skin taut, and the new nail a sharp, blood-filled crescent. The skeletal man exhaled a thin, sibilant whistle of satisfaction from his nose slits. Around them, the 10-legged, eye-covered flesh spiders scuttled back into the rafters with their own rhythmic organic plops as they folded into the dark shadows where they came from. The morgue was now an antiseptic womb, scrubbed of all life. Not a single trace of Frank's viscera remained on the gleaming steel. The chittering swarm had consumed everything, leaving only a cold, perfect hunger. The skeletal man smoothed his flesh hands down his torso, the skin parting under his touch to reveal a twitching lattice of borrowed veins and glistening organs pulsing within. He offered Silas a bow, the sound of grating bone and stretching sinew echoing in the stillness. Silas drew a breath, the sterile air filling his new lungs with a cold, vital hum. Power surged through him, a borrowed strength that made his joints pop and settle into unfamiliar, predatory configurations. He was not the dissolving thing in the tub, a vessel of terror and decay. He was the architect of a newer, more profound violation, remade in the image of his tormentor. He pivoted toward the doors, the motion unnervingly fluid. Behind him, the skeletal man rose, a tower of mismatched limbs and stitched-together anatomy. His elongated femurs scraped against each other with a sound like grinding teeth, a percussive rhythm on the tiled floor. The corridor warped in his presence. The air grew thick and frigid, the radiator pipes rattling in their brackets, a frantic Morse code of alarm. The tall thing unfolded itself behind Silas, a disjointed marionette whose movements defied anatomy, his skull scraping the acoustic tiles as the lights above sputtered and blackened. A thin, reedy whistle, the sound of air forced through slitted, malformed nostrils, was the only thing that broke the silence. The sterile, chemical chill of the hospital basement fell away as Silas stepped out into the night, but he didn't head for the sewers yet. The cookie of Frank had ignited a fire in his gut that wasn't just hunger. It was a demand for the sensory world he had lost. He found it at the end of a rain-slicked block, the gilded griddle. It was a relic of a diner, a chrome and neon capsule humming with a low, steady thrum of a world that still believed in grease and gravity. Silas pushed the heavy glass door open, and the bell chimed with a crisp, clean ting that didn't sound like a silver bell or a dying groan. The air inside was a thick, glorious assault. It smelled of rendered bacon fat, burnt coffee beans, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of griddle cakes. For the first time in a week, the perfume of the tomb was gone, replaced by the honest, heavy scent of life. Silas slid into a vinyl booth in the back, the red cracked leather groaning under his weight with a solid, reassuring sound. He kept his trench coat buttoned and his shades on, but beneath the fabric he felt electric. His skin was no longer a gray shroud. It was a firm, warm barrier that hummed with the concentrated vitality of the choice cut he'd just consumed. The waitress, a woman with a tired smile and a name tag that read, slid a ceramic mug of coffee in front of him. Silas reached out his hand, now perfectly rewoven, the ivory finger bone hidden under smooth, living skin, gripping the heavy handle. He took a sip. The taste didn't just return, it exploded. The coffee was a dark, bitter revelation, the heat of it scorching his tongue with a beautiful, stinging reality. He didn't just taste the bean. He tasted the steam, the water, the very essence of the morning. "I'll have the lumberjack special," Silas rasped, his voice no longer a gurgle but a deep, resonant hum. "And a side of biscuits and gravy. And the steak, medium rare." When the food arrived, it was a mountain of color and steam. The eggs were a vibrant, sun yellow. The bacon was a jagged, salty crimson. The steak was a deep, bloody purple. Silas ate with a rhythmic, predatory efficiency. The scratching in his ribs had settled into a low, purring contentment, a background static of approval as he fueled the vessel. He didn't get full. He could feel the friends inside him, the ivory-legged borders, instantly breaking down the proteins, weaving the nutrients into his failing architecture with a manic, high-speed energy. The more he ate, the more normal he felt. The stuttering in his vision smoothed out into a crystal-clear HD. The click in his jaw vanished into a supple, muscular hinge. He ordered a second round, then a third. He sat in the warm glow of the neon, surrounded by the clatter of silverware and the low murmur of the night shift workers, feeling like a king who had just reclaimed his throne. For this hour, in this booth, he wasn't a portion or a variable. He was Silas Thorne, and the world was delicious. The morning sun was a brutal, piercing needle through the bedroom curtains, but Silas didn't flinch. He sat up with a fluid, terrifyingly easy motion. His skin was still the radiant, predatory bronze of the night before, his muscles tight and humming with a vibrant, stolen energy. He felt more alive than he ever had in the 24 years before the park. The nightmares of the past week seemed to vanish. The familiar task of using the bathroom came upon him. The normal human duty he realized he had missed, and he proceeded to empty his bowels. Then the smell hit him. It was a thick, invisible wall of atmospheric rot that seemed to emanate from the bathroom. Silas stood, his bare feet silent on the hardwood, and repelled from the stench. It wasn't the metallic tang of his own decay. It was something far more visceral. In the toilet bowl lay a mass of black, oily bile and partially digested matter that looked like the carcass of an animal that had been rotting in the sun for weeks. It was a steaming, iridescent slurry that reeked of sulfur, fermented blood, and something deeply, biologically wrong. Silas stared at it, his stomach turning a slow, cold somersault. He realized then that his body wasn't digesting food anymore. It was merely stripping the vitality and discarding the dead matter as a toxic byproduct. Yet, as he flushed the mess away, watching the black goo swirl into the pipes, he felt a jolt of dark relief. At least the machinery is moving, he thought. The vessel is functional. He dressed for work with a meticulous, surgical precision. He wore a crisp white shirt and a dark tie, the fabric feeling wonderful against his firm, clear skin. He didn't need the cologne today. He smelled of nothing, a sterile, vacuum-like absence of scent that was its own kind of unsettling. When he arrived at the office, the rubbernecking was gone, replaced by a heavy, anxious silence. He walked straight to Mr. Sterling's office. The boss didn't look up from his desk until Silas stood in the doorway, the light from the hall casting a long, sharp shadow over the spreadsheets. "Silas," Sterling said, his voice flat and lacking its usual corporate warmth. He didn't offer a seat. Instead, he reached into his top drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the mahogany. It was the death certificate. Silas saw his own name, the date of the park incident, and the cold, blue ink of the coroner's signature. "I can't have a dead man on the payroll, Silas. Human resources is in a tailspin, and the legal team is already talking about insurance fraud," Sterling said, his eyes finally meeting Silas's yellow, unblinking gaze. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Silas didn't blink. He felt the internal scratching in his ribs give a low, rhythmic hum, a sound of mounting, predatory patience. "However," Sterling continued, his voice trembling slightly as he leaned back, trying to put distance between them, "if you can go back to the hospital, to the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and clear this mess up, if you can get a reversal of mortality, or whatever the hell they call a clerical miracle, you can reapply. But until that paper says you're breathing, you don't exist in this office." Silas picked up the certificate. The paper felt thin and flimsy, a joke of a document compared to the raw, pulsing power he felt in his veins. He looked at Sterling, and for a second he didn't see a boss. He saw a collection of soft fatty tissue and choice-cut ribbons that were currently wasting a perfectly good mahogany desk. "I'll clear it up," Silas rasped, his voice a deep, resonant vibration that made the Scotch glass on the desk rattle. He turned and walked out of the office, the death certificate folded neatly in his pocket. He didn't head for the bureau. He headed for the subway, the dark tunnels calling to the friends that were already waiting for him in the shadows. For 3 glorious, sun-drenched days, Silas Thorne was a god walking among men. He spent those 72 hours in a state of hypersensory euphoria. He walked the city streets with a confident, rhythmic stride, his new muscles humming with a stolen, vibrant electricity. The air tasted of possibility. The sunlight felt like a warm caress on his perfect, bronze skin, and every breath he drew was deep, clear, and effortless. He went to the gym and pushed his body until the machines groaned, feeling no fatigue, only a cold, efficient power. He went to high-end restaurants and ordered the most expensive, marbled steaks, savoring the rich, iron-heavy juices as if he were drinking the very essence of life. He was a masterpiece of choice cuts, a living testament to the skeletal man's craftsmanship. The internal scratching had settled into a low, purring background noise, a rhythmic vibration of contentment that felt like a well-oiled engine. The plateau of normalcy didn't just crumble, it vanished like a trapdoor opening beneath his feet. It started at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. Silas sat in his kitchen, a plate of thick-cut bacon and buttery, toast steaming in front of him. He took a bite, his jaw working with a rhythmic clack, clack, clack that had grown louder over the last 48 hours. The bacon hit his tongue and felt like a strip of wet, cold cardboard. The eggs tasted like flavorless paste. The reversal was over. The vitality he'd stolen from Frank had been burned through. The decline was a violent, accelerated slide. By 10 a.m., his skin was no longer radiant. It was the color of a bruised plum, sagging away from his cheekbones in translucent, waxy folds. By noon, his brand-new hair was shedding in massive, oily clumps, clogging the bathroom sink as he tried to wash away the sudden, aggressive return of the metallic rot. But as his body unraveled, a new, dark heat began to boil in his chest. It wasn't hunger, it was rage. He paced the cramped apartment, his joints grinding with the sound of dry gears. He couldn't stop thinking about Alara. The memory of her in that bed, her dark hair splayed across the pillows while another man's hand rested on her hip, felt like a serrated blade twisting in his gut. Awake, he hissed, the word a wet, gurgling eruption of black ichor that sprayed across the kitchen tile. I was not even presumed dead for even a week, and she already found someone to fill the space. The injustice of it felt more putrid than his own fermenting organs. He had clawed his way out of a body bag for her. He had endured the skeletal man's skeletal sizing and the frantic wet pops of the shadows for her. And she had looked at him like he was a stain on the floor. The scratching in his ribs reached a manic, celebratory pitch. The tiny, ivory-legged boarders weren't just hungry. They were responding to the pheromones of his fury. They wanted more than a cookie from a stranger in an alley. They wanted a meaningful harvest. Silas grabbed his trench coat, his ivory finger bone clicking rhythmically against the heavy fabric. He didn't need the dark shades today. His eyes were a brilliant, predatory yellow that burned with a singular, hateful light. He didn't head for the Bureau of Vital Statistics to fix his death certificate. He didn't head for the hospital to find a miracle. He headed back to Alara's apartment, his jerky, glitchy gait returning with a vengeance, the tall, skeletal man already unfolding from the shadows of the hallway to follow. Silas ignored the lock. A new key resided within him. From the dark space beside the doorframe, a knot of his own flesh bulged and split. A fist-sized tumor of muscle and chitin tore through his skin with a wet, tearing sound, dangling from a glistening umbilicus of tendon. 10 needle-like legs, jointed in reverse, scythed out, carving through the heavy oak not with force, but with a sickening, enzymatic dissolution. The wood peeled away like rot, a ragged, weeping hole opening in the door. The scene beyond was a lie. Warmth, the scent of vanilla and lavender. A carefully constructed bubble of peace, its fragile walls now trembling, about to be breached by the teeth and claws of a new and terrible reality. The boyfriend catapulted from the mattress, his face a clammy, bloodless mask, his fingers white-knuckled around a crystal decanter he'd swung like a cudgel. Alara was a cornered thing against the headboard, her ribcage a frantic cage for a heart trying to beat its way out. Her gaze flickered between Silas, his flesh now taut and luminous, his hair a thick, dark mane, and the silhouette that eclipsed the doorway behind him. The figure filled the frame, a colossus sheathed in black polymer that seemed painted onto unnaturally long limbs. With a wet, tearing sound, he ripped open his shirt. There was no chest, only a vertical chasm of flesh that yawned open to reveal a nest of glistening, blue-tinged cables pulsing like veins around a tangled knot of viscera. A chittering wave erupted from the cavity. Not beetles, but segmented things with too many legs, their shells clicking like 1,000 castanets as they flooded the floor, a boiling tide of chitin that surged toward the bed. "Silas, please." Alara's shriek was a thin, useless thing, shredded by the wet thuds from above. 3 shapes detached from the ceiling shadows, dropping with the soft, heavy pops of ripe melons bursting. They landed with a wet slap on the duvet. 10-legged spiders the size of corgis, their bodies swollen, rotting sacks that quivered with a palpable, feverish heat. A constellation of eyes, milky with decay, others a startling, infantile blue, locked onto the boyfriend's twitching calves. Then came the women, their forms perfect and bare, their movements a horrifying staccato flicker. One moment they were in the doorway, the next they were at the foot of the bed, their bodies lurching forward in a way that defied normal motion. Their heads lolled at broken angles, necks pulverized, useless. From their smooth, perfect stomachs, vast mouths split open, caverns lined with needle-sharp teeth. Serpentine tongues, thick and muscular, shot out, lashing around the boyfriend's waist and wrists, the grip crushing bone as they slammed him back onto the mattress with a wet thud. The bone centipedes poured forth in a writhing cascade, a sound like 1,000 chalk skeletons being dragged across a blackboard. They didn't hesitate. Their chitinous legs, serrated like rusty saws, ripped through the silk sheets with a wet, tearing sound, digging into the yielding flesh of the boyfriend's stomach. The man's body convulsed, a silent scream trapped in his throat as his skin split. His guts became a churning soup of viscera, his skeleton dissolving into a slurry of bone fragments and marrow as the centipedes tunneled through him, their passage leaving a network of pulsating, hollow tunnels. The 10-legged spiders descended, their legs clicking like 1,000 knitting needles. They weren't just cutting, they were flaying. With surgical precision, they peeled back layers of skin and muscle, the translucent ribbons of flesh quivering in the dim light. They wove these strips into intricate, pulsating cubes, each one a miniature testament to the man's former self, a grotesque tapestry of his own meat. The woman stared, her mind a shattered mirror, as the man she had known was systematically disassembled. The skeletal figure loomed over her, his breath a cold, dry wind smelling of dust and forgotten things. His bloodshot eyes, twin pools of ancient decay, locked onto hers. He didn't raise a hand to strike. Instead, his bone fingers, sharpened to fine points, traced the lines of her body, a cartographer mapping a new territory. The rhythmic clicking of his joints was a metronome for the room's symphony of horror. Each click a promise of the thread he would soon extract from the pulsating, blue-veined cavity in his own chest. The figure at the foot of the bed stood frozen, a silent observer in this theater of butchery. The room itself seemed to warp, the familiar curves of the furniture dissolving into sharp, angular shapes. The entities worked with a horrifying efficiency, their movements a dance of anatomical desecration, their purpose as alien as their forms. The tall skeletal man leaned closer, his bone fingers extending until they were a hair's breadth from her skin. The clicking of his joints was a frantic, syncopated beat, a counterpoint to the panicked drumming of her heart. His torso, a hollowed-out cage of bone, pulsed with a sickly, blue light, the veins within throbbing like trapped worms. The light cast elongated, writhing shadows that danced like specters on the walls. A carpet of black beetles, a living, breathing oil slick, surged across the floor, their shells clicking together in a dry, chitinous wave. The 3 10-legged spiders waited, their multiple eyes like a constellation of tiny, glittering stars, each one reflecting the room's gruesome glow. They were poised, their bodies taut with anticipation, ready for the next stage of their unholy creation. Every creature moved in perfect, horrifying sync, their silent communication turning the bedroom into a place where the laws of nature were rewritten in blood and bone. The consumption of the choice cut from a Lara acted like a chemical ignition, surging through Silas's failing systems with a violent, restorative heat. As he swallowed the last of the rewoven, dark meat, the gray rot vanished from his skin in a visible wave. His hair anchored itself deep into his scalp, thick and lustrous, and the yellow fever in his eyes cooled into a clear, piercing amber. He felt radiant. He felt earned. He stepped out of her apartment building into the bright midday sun, no longer a ghost, but a physical presence that seemed to draw the light to him. He walked back to the park, the very place where his life had first stuttered and failed. This time, the grass didn't feel like a shroud. It felt like a carpet. He watched the children playing near the fountain, their high-pitched laughter sounding like a symphony of pure, uncomplicated energy. He didn't claw at his neck this time. Instead, he walked to the hot dog cart, the smell of the steaming water and cheap meat a glorious, savory assault. He bought one, fully loaded, and sat on the same green-slatted bench where he had once died. He ate slowly, savoring the snap of the casing and the sharp tang of the mustard. Every bite was a victory. Every swallow was a confirmation of his dominance over the grave. For 3 days, Silas lived a life of quiet, high-sensory luxury. He enjoyed long, lingering lunches at sidewalk cafes, drinking expensive wine and watching the portions walk by with a look of detached, predatory affection. He was a man out of time, a masterpiece of the skeletal man's craft. The internal scratching had settled into a rhythmic, satisfied purr, a low vibration of bone legs that felt like a warm engine at idle. But on the fourth afternoon, while he was finishing a plate of seared scallops, the flavor didn't just fade, it died. The scallops turned into cold, rubbery lumps of flavorless grease in his mouth. The wine tasted like vinegar and iron. The Ilera fuel had been exhausted, burned away to keep his gray skin from showing through his expensive shirts. The hunger hit him like a physical blow to the stomach, a hollow, gnawing void that made his joints suddenly scream with a dry, sandpaper grind. But this time, it wasn't fear that filled the empty space. It was rage. He thought about the office. He thought about Sterling sliding that death certificate across the mahogany desk, treating him like a clerical error rather than a miracle. He thought about the way the man had looked at him, with a clinical, corporate disgust. "I don't exist, Sterling," Silas rasped, his voice dropping into a resonant, dangerous baritone that made the water in his glass ripple. "You want a miracle? I'll show you a miracle." He stood up, his movements already becoming slightly stuttered, the glitchy, jerky gait beginning to return to his long legs. He didn't head for the subway to hide. He headed for the skyscraper downtown, his blackened fingernails digging into his palms as he pictured the 10-legged spiders unfolding from Sterling's mahogany ceiling. The high-rise office was a sterile mausoleum, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and the low, mournful hum of the servers. Silas moved through the cubicles, no longer a man, but a puppet whose strings were pulled by an unseen hand. His gait was smooth, predatory, a chilling contrast to his earlier, erratic movements. The 6 feet 9 inches skeletal man followed, a phantom in the periphery, his head bowed to avoid the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. His long, bony legs made a sickening, rhythmic clacking sound on the carpet, a sound like 1,000 tiny bones being snapped in half, each step a beat in a march towards an unknown, terrible destination. In the corner office, Mr. Sterling was hunched over a spread of spreadsheets, a half-empty glass of scotch nearby. He didn't look up until the scent reached him. Not the cologne this time, but the smell of cold earth and the sweet, cloying rot of 100 pulsating thoraxes. "Silas, what are you doing here? I told you to work things." Sterling's voice died as the 10-legged flesh spiders began to unfold from the acoustic ceiling tiles. They hit his mahogany desk with a series of heavy, wet pops, their crab legs skittering over the paperwork. The multiple eyes on their rotting thoraxes, some cataract white, some bright and childlike, rolled in their sockets, fixating on Sterling's soft, well-fed neck. Sterling scrambled back, his chair hitting the glass wall behind him. Before he could scream, 2 beautiful, naked women appeared in the center of the room with a stuttering, glitchy jump. Their heads lolled to the side, necks long broken, as their torso mouths split wide from groin to chest. 1,000-needle teeth ground together with a sound like a meat grinder, and their long, serpent tongues lashed out, wrapping around Sterling's wrists and ankles, pinning him spread eagle against his own window. The ivory bone centipedes spilled out from the vents, a dry, rattling carpet of teeth that flooded over Sterling's polished shoes. They swarmed up his legs, their toothed legs shredding through the expensive wool of his trousers. Sterling watched in a paralyzed, wide-eyed trance as his own thighs began to pulse and liquefy, the centipedes burrowing deep to turn his sturdy skeleton into a fine, calcium slush. The 10-legged things skittered down from the ceiling, a shower of clicking chitin and twitching palps. They descended upon Sterling's soft middle, their many-jointed legs piercing his skin with a sound like wet paper tearing. They did not cut, but rather hooked and peeled, pulling back long, glistening strips of subcutaneous fat and the red rope of muscle beneath. The flesh didn't fall away. It was extracted, drawn out in quivering ribbons that immediately began to warp and contract in the air. The exposed surfaces shimmered, the cellular structure collapsing and refolding into impossibly perfect, crystalline cubes of meat, glistening with a thin, clear fluid before the first bead of blood could well up and fall. The tall man moved with a dry, bone-on-bone creak. He hooked his fingers into the seam of his own torso and pulled the skin wide. It parted with a wet, tearing sound, revealing not organs, but a writhing nest of black, chitinous beetles and thick, pulsing cables of blue bioluminescence. He plucked a vein from the tangle, its light throbbing in time with a slow, arrhythmic beat. The thing was hot and slick, coated in a viscous yellow fluid. He began to lash the glowing cord around the cubes of meat, the light from the vein causing the flesh to take on a strange, semi-translucent quality. The beetles, dislodged by his movements, cascaded onto the mahogany desk in a torrent of clicking shells. They descended upon the spreading puddle of scotch and blood, their mandibles scraping at the wood until it gleamed with a wet, polished darkness. Silas remained in the doorway, a statue witnessing a sacred, profane ritual. The man who'd held his leash was being systematically dismantled, his very essence being portioned out. The air was thick with the sounds, the wet suction of flesh being detached, the dry crack of bone adjusting, the soft, rhythmic gurgle from the tall man's open chest. The lanky man finished his work, a final knot of blue light cinching the last parcel. He turned to Silas, his neck giving a series of sharp, calcified pops, and bowed low. From the center of the last bundle, he produced a prize, a dense, dark mass, still quivering. It was Sterling's heart, its chambers collapsed, wrapped in a web of glowing blue fibers. The organ pulsed with a weak, stolen light, a tiny, dying sun. Silas extended his hand, his fingers brushing against the man's. The other's skin was cold and dry, like old parchment stretched over bone. The heart was heavy in his palm, a hot, dense weight that beat against his skin in a slow, arrhythmic tremor. Its surface was slick with a greasy, amber fluid that coated his fingers. He didn't consume it. He slipped it into the deep lining of his coat. It settled against his thigh, a living furnace of warmth and vibration, pressing against the other cold, hard shapes nestled there. Frank's liver, the boyfriend's eyes, the others, a grim collection of stolen moments. He turned away from the scene. The office was now immaculate, the air clean, the desk polished to a black mirror. The tall figure and his clicking, twitching companions receded into the room's deepening shadows, their wet whistling a lullaby for the newly vacant space. He ignored the main lobby. The wail of sirens was a physical pressure, and the flashing lights from the street sliced through the windows, piercing his eyes like needles. He needed the quiet dampness, the places where the city's seepage collected. In the alley, the smell was a thick blanket of decay and whetstone. He found a manhole cover, the iron ring cold and rough against his new, stronger fingers. The metal groaned as he heaved it aside, the sound swallowed by the urban cacophony. The rusted ladder descended into a darkness that smelled of ancient water, mineral rot, and something else, something familiar and cloying. He climbed down, the heavy heart in his pocket a steady, reassuring drumbeat against his leg as he disappeared into the city's bowels. The sewers were a cathedral of damp concrete and echoing drips. Silas walked the narrow stone ledge, the black water churning beside him. As he moved deeper into the labyrinth, far beneath the feet of the millions of portions walking the surface, the sounds of the night changed. The distant roar of traffic was replaced by a frantic, rhythmic scratching from the pipes above. One by one, the 10-legged flesh spiders began to unfold from the mossy brickwork, hitting the wet floor with a series of heavy, wet pops. Their children's eyes rolled in the dark, reflecting the faint light from the street grates far above. The tall, skeletal man manifested at the end of the tunnel, his head ducked under the low, dripping ceiling. He stood in the shallow, black flow, his skeletal knees clicking. He reached in his chest and pulled out a long, glowing blue vein, lashing it to a rusted pipe to create a hanger for the harvest. Silas sat against the damp wall and pulled a portion from his pocket. He unwrapped the membrane, the scent of the boss's meat filling the tunnel. As he ate, he watched the beautiful, naked women begin their stuttering, jerky dance in the reflection of the sewage, their torso mouths wide and waiting. The ivory bone centipedes began to pour out of the cracks in the masonry, a dry, rattling carpet of ivory that flooded towards Silas, sensing the fresh marrow he carried. He was no longer a man hiding in a hole. He was the king of the deep, and the sewers were the new pantry. Other short stories and novellas available on Amazon.